Generative grammar is one of those concepts in academics that, even though it addresses a pretty simple idea, the structure of language and sentences, the theory itself is actually rather complex. So when I explain it, I'm going to try and use as basic of examples and terminology as possible. So generative grammar was a theory proposed in the 1950s by a man who is regarded as the father of modern linguistics, Professor Noam Chomsky, who argued that basically the way that sentences are structured, or what's called their syntax, specific individual phrases or grammatical mechanisms can be applied more generally and to any type of sentence regardless of their context, so long as they are structured in a sensical way. So all that means is that very simple mechanisms within grammar, so take for instance prepositional phrases, direct and indirect objects, object of a preposition, subject and predicate, all those concepts, all those rules within grammar, they aren't just applied within sentences that accommodate for those rules to make sense. Those rules exist independently of the way a sentence is structured. Those rules can be applied to any type of sentence in any context, so long as the sentence is crafted in ways that allow for those rules to make sense. They can be generalized. And this concept is also known as transformational grammar. Now, let's go into an example to kind of illustrate this complex idea. So, in the sentence, Sally goes to the park. Sally, of course, is the subject. Goes is the verb, or the predicate, the main verb, and then the park is, of course, the main object which she's trying to go. So what this means is that before the proposition of transformational grammar, it was believed that that was the only way that sentence could make sense with all of those elements. Basically, in order for those elements to all those elements to be applied in different ways. So for example, if we were to take Sally, or we were to take the park, or we were to take goes, those individual components would have to be addressed separately. Basically, they would have to be put in different sentences if we were to change the framing of the sentence or change the sentence entirely. So if we wanted to say that Sally wants to go to the park, the whole sentence would have to change in order for those rules to still make sense, for them to be grammatically correct. However, Chomsky argued in his transformational analysis and his later book, Syntactic Structures, which came out in 1957, that no, in fact, those mechanisms can be applied in the same sentence altogether, so long as the sentence is rephrased. So if you wanted to make it a future sentence with a future tense, so for instance, Sally went or will go to the park, then all you would have to do is rephrase it in a way that makes sense. So basically, you would just add that particular phrase. Sally will go to the park. You might have to move some words around for it to make sense, but the sentence itself can still make sense with all of those elements placed into it. Now, what's so important about this idea is not just the fact that it revolutionized grammar. I mean, that's great. But more so, what it has allowed for is now a new understanding of how communication works. And Chomsky illustrated this through applying his theory of generative grammar to other academic fields, such as psychology. What Chomsky did after he proposed generative grammar was he came up with the idea of, quote, language acquisition devices. He basically believed that the ability of humans to communicate through language, through structured verbal, and in some cases body communication, that was an innate biological process that humans were born with. That capability was not learned. That capability to understand and speak a language is something that humans, at least most humans, are born with. The framing of this idea in psychology is called a poverty of stimulus. And when he wrote this theory, he disagreed with the behaviorist psychologists like B.F. Skinner, who believed that language, was something that is learned, or basically that the ability to understand language is reinforced through behavioral modification. So like praising a child whenever they say their first word, or encouraging them to speak, and etc., and etc. Chomsky believed that this paradigm was wrong, and that, as I just said earlier, babies, when they're born, have instinctually hardwired within them the ability to communicate. He argued that basically this laid the foundation for what's called the theory of universal grammar, that all languages are rooted in some basic phonetic structures, that all languages are interlinked, and they're interlinked in the human capability at birth to be able to communicate in the first place. He argued that all languages, whether it's Japanese, Chinese, Russian, Sanskrit, Latin, English, whatever, all of those are rooted in the first babblings of a baby at birth. All of this led Chomsky to come to the conclusion that humans have a particular age period where the ability to comprehend and learn a specific language becomes critical. What Chomsky then creatively named this time frame was the critical period, and he defined it as between the ages of 3 and 10. Within this time frame is when humans have the ability to comprehend and learn to speak a particular language through understanding the grammatical functions of it. He argued that if a human eventually exceeded this limit, so was older than the age of 10, and did not learn a specific language, they unfortunately would never be able to do so because they lacked the neurological and psychological development to actually comprehend and acquiesce grammatical language. Now, the best example of this was Jeannie the Wild Child, who was a young girl who was socially isolated to the point where she never learned language by the time she was 13 years old. And despite significant improvements in her psycholinguistic and psychological therapy as a teenager, she was never able to comprehend or speak any language of any kind. Lastly, one critical theory that may seem simple face value, but was actually a radical discovery with regards to psycholinguistics, was Chomsky's theory of semantics versus syntax. And he illustrated this through a famous sentence which states, "Colorless green ideas sleep furiously." Now, what Chomsky believed accurately is that this sentence makes absolutely no sense. First of all, how is green colorless? It is by definition a color. What does it mean to sleep furiously, and how does a color sleep? Now, there are certain philosophical interpretations you could get into as to the abstract meaning of this sentence, but at face value, it makes no semantic sense. However, what Chomsky also pointed out is that this sentence is grammatically correct. Technically, it follows all of the grammatical rules that make this sentence correct structurally. So what he argued, what his conclusion from this was, is that a sentence, when it's being crafted, has to not only take into account its syntactic structure, its grammatical correctness, but also its semantic correctness. Overall, all of these theories significantly contributed to Chomsky's understanding of grammar, as well as our understanding of communication and the ability to exchange information and ideas today.